Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, the podcast that looks at geopolitics in historical context with my colleague Suzanne Rain. And we have a special guest on this week because we are dealing with events in the United States, but also the consequences of the Trump election victory on China and the Middle East. So very pleased to welcome Bill Hurst back to our podcast. Bill, welcome. Are you happy with the result?
Honestly, I'm surprised by the result and actually a bit perplexed because for a long time leading up to the election, I was pretty confident in saying that either Harris would win by a large margin or Trump would win by a historically narrow margin. And the reason I thought that is because for many decades, at least 25, 30 years, it's been very difficult for any Republican candidate to capture the majority of the popular vote nationally. The Electoral College is skewed in a way that advantages Republicans, and so it gives them a bit of an advantage there. But Democrats have had a very strong advantage in the popular vote for a long time. Harris's whole strategy also revolved around turning out large numbers of voters that don't always vote, right? Younger voters, minority voters, lower income voters, but then also trying to capture a very large percentage of women voters who ordinarily wouldn't always vote Democratic. And so if she were to succeed in doing that, she would have cobbled together a really massive coalition combined with her already, fairly strong advantage, I thought, in the popular vote. That would lead her to a kind of a landslide victory or blowout. Something as large or even larger than what we eventually saw Trump do. But on the other hand, I thought Trump is disadvantaged, right? The Republicans at a disadvantage when it comes to the popular vote. Trump also is at something of a ceiling in terms of his support base, it seemed, right? It was difficult for me to see how he would capture new voters. Everybody already has an opinion about him, including a majority of people who had a negative opinion about him going into the election. And some of his rhetoric and base for mobilization, the methods of his mobilization are actually quite alienating to many constituencies that he might otherwise seek to capture to vote for him. So it seemed to me very likely that it would be impossible that he could win by a large margin. Honestly, on the day, I thought it was far more likely that Harris would win. Just looking at sort of the way things were shifting in the last week, 10 days before the election, the poll out of Iowa that showed older white women in rural areas supposedly moving towards Harris, that looked like a sign, along with some other data points, that there really was a swing in the direction of Harris building the kind of coalition that she was trying to. Now, what actually ended up happening is that Trump somehow, and I think we're really still trying to parse how, was able to mobilize young men, including young non-white men in large numbers, who didn't usually vote in the past or voted only infrequently or had voted for Democrats in the past, to turn out and vote for him. And he was able actually to win a majority, it seems, based on exit polls, of votes from white women. Non-white women voted decisively for Harris, but white women seem to have voted mostly for Trump, which would be a repeat of 2016. Now, what's also really interesting about this is that some of the recent analysis in the last few days that I've seen, and I don't know if this will hold to be the case, but some of the recent analysis points to a pattern of what are called undervotes. So people voting for the presidency, but not for all of the other offices on the ballot. And it appears, according to some of this analysis, that Trump's margins in all the swing states can actually be explained through undervotes, meaning that there were thousands of people, at least a couple of 100,000 people, which would be the total margin across these states, it seems, who turned out in these states and only voted for Trump and didn't bother to vote for their representative in Congress or the governor or the senator that may have been up or any other local offices. If that's true, that would be a very interesting wrinkle in this pattern.
Bill, I have a thought about the white female vote, which is the same thought that I've consistently had about the female terrorist, which is that I don't know why, but particularly in our Western democracies, we hold this view that somehow women are nicer and women are less likely to support a cause or a person who's perceived as being not very nice. And it comes up again and again and again on news feeds about women and children, and particularly in war. And as a woman, I find it extraordinary because it suggests that I always have better thoughts and I am always less capable of choosing to do something bad through my own agency. So you often have the need, so if women are involved in people trafficking, they're victims rather than perpetrators. If women are terrorists, again, they've been preyed on and manipulated rather than choosing to do it. And I have a book behind me, which I know is a controversial book by a lady called Eileen MacDonald. She wrote in 1991 called Shoot the Women First, which was guidance apparently given to Germany's GSG-9 elite anti-terrorist squad based on some of the work that they'd had to do against the Red Army faction. And the suggestion was that women terrorists have stronger characters, more power and more energy. And so once women decide something, they decided actually more strongly. And I think for me, although I had a wobble at the end when everyone told me Harris was going to win, so I started to believe it. But I always thought Trump was going to win because I think people assume that because you've got a woman candidate, that all the women are going to think, let's vote for her. And in fact, it's not the case that women are any less radical or inclined to support the extreme option that men are. And I worry about this weird chauvinism in all of our commentary, which continues to think that because they're women, they must be nicer. I put that to you both with an evil laugh.
Well, I mean, I think that it is interesting, for example, that more women as a percentage of the total vote voted for Trump in 2016 and in 2024 than in 2020. It seems, again, based on exit polls. We don't actually know exactly how each individual has voted. And so that is interesting, particularly in the context, not just that, oh, why wouldn't women vote for a female candidate, but if Trump is indeed perceived by many, many people as being somewhat odious or bigoted in a lot of his views and presentation, and some of his rhetoric is frankly quite bigoted, a lot of it is bigoted directly against women, and his sort of misogynistic, almost proudly so. And so that's, I guess, what sometimes confuses me is that what is it that attracts the same reason why sort of young black men in larger numbers have voted for Trump, it seems, this election than in the past, when some of his rhetoric is overtly racist. It seems interesting that voters would be attracted to a candidate who is outwardly and pretty explicitly demeaning or hateful towards them.
I used to think that about women who supported the Taliban and Daesh. And I knew lots of women who supported the Taliban. And I had arguments with them. I said, why would you support the Taliban? They want to lock you up. And they said, because that's what God teaches. And if that's what God teaches, that's what I should do. So again, we make this assumption in the West, oh yeah, all the women must hate the Taliban because the Taliban is anti-women. But we don't see, especially because we can't see, all the women who support them, all the women who support Daesh. And Ali, in Iran, we see the women who are taking their clothes off and being arrested, but we don't see all the conservative women, which I think is the majority, who are not protesting. And I think that the number of women who are protesting is a really small percentage.
My answer to that, Suzanne, really is that the people who do the protesting are always in a minority in any movement. Yeah. I mean, the suffragettes, I think, were in a minority. I think if you're looking at it in sheer statistical numbers, I mean, most protest movements are led by essentially a vanguard who will be at the tip of the iceberg. And it really depends on how deep that iceberg is. But I suspect that, yes, while I think in any political movement, more than 60% of people will be sitting on the fence until they see which direction of travel things are going. I mean, the fact is whether the two extremes, if you will, those ultra-conservative and ultra-progressive, which is able to tip the balance. And where I would disagree with you, I think, on the women's issue in Iran is I think the balance is already tipping.
Yeah, and I should say, I know I'm going to get into trouble for saying it, but I'm saying it only to kind of, we're not going to dwell on this point.
But the other thing I would say, to get back to Trump, is I think we also have to be aware of how bad the Democrat campaign was. I mean, we talk about women. What about that dreadful advert they put out with Julia Roberts and a sort of a voiceover telling, women not to be bullied by their husbands and how they vote in the voting booths? And I mean, basically, a lot of women who voted Republican said, we don't want to be patronized by the Democrats. I mean, in some ways, for me, it's not so much the fact that Trump attracted lots of voters to his side who we wouldn't necessarily think he could. I think part of it is the push factor rather than the pull factor, the push factor away from the Democrats of people saying that, we're fed up being, patronized by this, metropolitan elite, if we're to coin a phrase. And I was a bit surprised. I said, why do you think? And of course, they were all talking about the economy. This is before the assassination attempt or before Kamala comes in, whatever. This is while Joe Biden is still in there. So people were sort of assuming on the basis of the economy. But what really struck me, and I come here, Bill, Suzanne, really as someone who's not an expert on US politics, but I was very struck that it seemed to me that the Democrats hadn't learned anything from 2016. I mean, they just simply had not picked up the message. And I think the one concession they made was Kamala not talking about the glass ceiling as much as Hillary did. I'm going to be the first woman president. But presumably that was implicit in the whole thing that, this would be a very radical change and a shift. And we're sort of baffled by this reaction that has led to Trump actually doing much better. I mean, I agreed with Bill. I thought it was either going to be a Harris, so she was going to sweep it in some way, or Trump was going to sneak it in. I thought it was going to be. I didn't think he was going to win all 7 of the swing states. But when you look at it, I was a bit struck by the sheer, they just sort of assumed that women would vote for them. I'm talking about the Democrats. And again, looking at it from an amateur point of view in that sense, but in terms of politics, is people will react against being told that they are not doing things in their own interest because they're either a bit stupid or they feel a bit intimidated or something like that. They will tend to react against that. And I think we saw this in Brexit, by the way. I mean, we saw this in Brexit when Obama came over and said, you'll be at the back of the queue. I think it was a very bad choice by Cameron to get Obama to come and do that. And I think you saw the same thing again. I think this is a rejection of a sort of a style of politics that people don't want to do anymore, which we find very familiar and is nice to us because it basically represents us. I mean, in that sense, it's metropolitan elite, what we can relate to. But I think for many other people, it just doesn't connect. And I think it was interesting with Trump because, I mean, when we come and talk about China and the Middle East and whatever, there is a rhetoric and there's a bombastic rhetoric. And for me, the puzzle of Trump, the enigma of Trump, I don't want to flatter it too much by calling it an enigma, but let's say that is that he talks a talk, but he doesn't always walk the walk, if I can put it that way. He does quite different things sometimes. And it's interesting to see. So he has all these, the immediate one that comes to mind, and interested in your views on this, Bill, as you say, some of his comments can be very misogynist. I'm going to look after you, even if you don't want to be looked after. I mean, that's, and yet the first thing he does is appoint a woman as his chief of staff, the first woman to be a chief of staff, and you sort of think, well, that's slightly different to what I expected. And apparently I don't know anything about her, but the ice woman or whatever, but people rate her quite highly. I mean, from what I can see, I don't know. But again, he's constantly doing things that suddenly make us think, where is he coming from? What's the ideology or the rationale behind that? Of course, the answer to that is basically there isn't one. He basically does things on a very personal level as far as I can see. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know, Bill, what you think, or Suzanne, I mean, how you see that particularly.
No, I think that's true. What I also think is that, the rhetoric is useful for sort of mobilizing people to vote or to get behind a certain kind of policy or whatever it is that he's trying to deploy. But the actual task of governing or implementing has to do with, who can he trust, who is also competent. And I think the problem that Trump is having now, not to say that, I forget her first name, but Wiles, I think is her surname, the new chief of staff, or anybody else that he's appointing is or isn't competent or trustworthy. But I think the circle of potential appointees who Trump finds trustworthy or loyal, who are also competent, is shrinking, right? We saw this very abruptly in the election campaign where so many former officials from his first administration came out and said they wouldn't work with him, that he wasn't democratic, that he was not competent or viable, or that he was too dangerous. many of those people are seen by most observers as being highly competent, right? Who were saying that's what made it effective. These are very competent people, from the military or from other administrative arms of the government who were saying, this guy's terrible. We shouldn't work with him. We shouldn't elect him. And so I think there's a lot of people out there like that who may not want to work with Trump. And many of those are the most competent potential people. And there's also a lot of people who may sign on to a job if given one by Trump and be competent, but who Trump doesn't find sufficiently loyal or trustworthy. So I think he's going to have difficulty staffing the administration in many parts with people who he deems trustworthy, who are also competent.
Susie Wiles.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think that's clearly one of the things which is going on as we're recording this and which will continue, which is Trump is making his picks. And some of those will really matter to what we're going to come on to talk about now, which is America's role in the world, because they will run State Department, CIA, who knows what's going to happen to FBI, defense. It will be interesting to see who those personnel are, because then all of the different state departments around the world are going to be thinking, well, how do I engage and what do we think this is likely to be the policy on? And I think one of the things on this podcast that we're reluctant to do is become another podcast, which is pontificating about what kind of Ukraine Trump and Putin are imagining they're going to get a deal on, because the answer is we just don't really know. But I think I'm interested, Bill, first of all, in hearing from you about China, because while you can see that for Putin, this probably is a good result, on the face of it, if I was looking at it, I think it actually is quite complicated for President Xi of China. Or is it?
Well, I mean, in the first administration of Trump, the first time he was elected, like in 2016, I think there was sort of an underlying current, albeit a subtle one, in Chinese politics that preferred Trump to Hillary Clinton going into the election. That it was there's a general preference, longstanding since the 1970s at least, in Chinese politics for Republican presidents in the United States, because in general, Republicans have been more predictable, right? They've been clear about what their security priorities are, where the red lines are, what can and cannot be negotiated or dealt with. And on the economy, they've tended to be pretty pro-business and pro-free trade, pro-globalization. So from China's point of view, the Republicans have usually been better than the Democrats. So going into 2016, they sort of assumed that it would be better to have Trump than Clinton. There's also a particular negative history with Hillary Clinton that goes back into the 1990s from the Chinese government's point of view. So they're really not unhappy to see Trump elected.
Sorry, I'm interrupting because I don't know what that negative history is with Hillary Clinton.
It actually, apropos our previous topic, goes back to the Women's Conference in 1994 outside of Beijing, where Hillary Clinton made quite forthright comments in support of gender equality and women's rights, some of which were at least interpreted as being quite pointed against the Chinese government and its own record on gender politics and equality, which didn't sit well with the hosts.
Thank you. Sorry, I interrupted, but how fascinating.
That it starts from that and spirals from there. During her time as Secretary of State, also the U.S.-China relationship was not an easy one. Again, from China's point of view, you could argue about whether Clinton handled it well or poorly. So there was a particular reason to dislike her, and in general, the Republicans were seen as better from China's perspective. But one of the first things Trump came in and did was to start the trade war, which obviously was not a positive from China's perspective. It was something of a surprise, even though it was to some extent telegraphed by Trump's rhetoric in the debates and throughout the whole process. But China was unsure how to react, at least at first, and then spent the remainder of the administration really trying to figure out how to respond on the economy in a way that could be productive. Because I think there was a fairly clear consensus in China that the trade war and Trump's subsequent economic policies were not really helpful to American economic interests, that he must be doing this for a reason other than actually helping the U.S. economy. And therefore, they required a response that would be sort of political tit for tat, but how to calibrate that and how to get to a solution wasn't clear. And there was debate, I think, inside China on how to handle this. what kind of response to make. The initial retaliation on the tariffs was very clever and very subtle in that it targeted agriculture and it targeted red states and swing states as much as possible in the particular sectors that were represented there. It was very clearly meant as a knock against Trump, against the Republicans, and against actually the key sector for American exports to China, which is agriculture. And so that didn't work. And then other kinds of broader responses didn't work. Eventually, they kind of found a working solution, but it was not easy. And so I think this time, looking at it, how is China going to see this? There is a consensus among a lot of observers that it's basically economically problematic, but politically maybe an opportunity, such that this will hurt bilateral trade. Definitely, it will not help the economic relationship between the world's two largest economies. It will also probably, if Trump does anything like what he's talking about in the election, it's going to mean a diminution of the global trading system. That there'll be less global trade. Globalization will take a step backwards. All of this, from China's perspective, is not good. It means it will be harder to right the ship of the economy that's really in some serious trouble and has been for quite a while, I would say since at least 2015. But in the last couple of years since COVID, really kind of visibly and viscerally in trouble. And it's difficult to fix that if trade is an important component of GDP growth and trade is being hurt across the board. But it's a political opportunity, some say, and I have a tendency maybe to at least tentatively agree, for China in that it makes it easier for China to portray the United States as the rogue actor, as the source of instability, as the unfair or unreliable partner, and to portray China as actually the upholder of rules, norms, and institutions globally, as the source of stability and generosity, as the reliable player, the steady hand, the good guarantor of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, the good source of international aid, whether that be vaccines or infrastructure projects or anything like this. And I think that job is made a lot easier by Trump's election and the way that's perceived in many parts of the world, and possibly by the way Trump may behave in office.
One of the things you were saying there, which it sort of rings true with Iran, for instance, is this idea that they've always felt that Republican presidents are going to be better for them, even when the evidence is clearly weighted against it. And I remember years ago, I would have to argue with them that Clinton was an opportunity, which they obviously felt he wasn't. And, obviously you had the dual containment and all that. And they were looking forward to George W. Bush as a great opportunity. And I kept saying to them, I don't think you really understand who this guy is. This is not traditional republicanism in that sense. And they absolutely resisted it. No, Republicans are great. It's all about oil. Don't worry about human rights. It's all transactional. We'll get a deal. It'll be fine. And this is back in, we're talking about sort of the early noughties. I mean, things hadn't really got bad yet, But then you get the similar thing with Trump's first election. So, one of the things that entertained me is that The Art of the Deal, translated into Persian, was sort of a bestseller in Iran. I mean, everyone loved it, right? I mean, they wanted to read it.
And was it a bestseller before he became a politician?
Yeah. Well, they were, obviously he was campaigning, so they thought, he's in, you remember in those days, he had to go through the primaries then. So, we sort of had him.
So it wasn't like he hadn't been famous in Iran for years.
Well, they knew, I always used to joke that, Trump is actually the first Iranian president of the United States. He's got all the, he's, a lot of bombast, a little bit unreliable, unpredictable. It's great stuff, and I said the Iranians can relate to him. There's absolutely no rules-based order here, And of course they liked it, and they liked the glitz, and they liked the sort of fancy stuff and whatever. And I'm sure many of them would have been aware of him through The Apprentice or whatever. But yeah, in the run-up to this Art of the Deal was like, it was a fairly good seller. And people would say at the time, and this again, I used to say, even when I was talking to Iranians, I said, well, I'm not sure what he's going to be about, whatever. And they said, no, Trump, perfect. We can make a deal. He's the art of the deal. We can make a deal. We can sort it out. And they sort of ignored anything else in the sort of the hinterland about, what his views might be towards Israel or what he might, and all this sort of thing. They just said, we can cut a deal. Democrats, not good. even though, I mean, this is the interesting thing, they'd spent all these years discussing with the Obama administration. The Obama administration, I think, probably went out of its way to try and get a deal, with Iran. I mean, really did. And as you know, I have certain criticisms of the way these things were handled, but nonetheless, it's fairly clear that Obama cut Iran a lot of slack. Even so, they thought, no, the Republicans will come and it'll be fine. But I think there was a dual narrative going on there, and it mirrors exactly what Bill said about, the Chinese. That there's one side of the Iranian sort of political elite that thought, yeah, we can cut a deal with this guy. But there was another side of the Iranian political elite that thought, oh my God, this is such a great opportunity, because at least we'll be able to say it's not our fault. It's the Americans. Look how useless they are. And of course, in Trump pulling out of the JCPOA in 2018, it was a gift for them, actually, in that sense, because I don't think the JCPOA was working anyway. But the fact is, by Trump pulling out, it focused everyone's activities, certainly in this country and France and Germany, focused everyone's activities on sort of keeping the Americans in or keeping the Americans involved or keeping the whole thing alive. Nobody dealt with actually the substantive issues at the core of it, or indeed what Iran was doing. I mean, what Iran was doing elsewhere. So there was this sort of dual advantage they could gain from this. And I still think now, if you look at the current, I think they have been a bit surprised. I think there's a little bit of anxiety about it. The world has certainly changed. I was talking to some colleagues and they said that the sort of approach we had, in 2016, where, you had Zarif leading the Iranian nuclear talks and very eloquent American-speaking sort of Iranian. And Trump could more easily be seen as the bad guy. But now, with the war in Ukraine, with the war in Gaza, Lebanon, and the conflict with Israel, it's no longer that clear. You can't sort of say to people that, the Americans under Trump are automatically going to be the people we need to focus on, because the Iranians are bedded down with Putin and other things, and the whole narrative has changed. And I should add here, we're probably different from the Chinese experience, of course, although I don't know what public opinion is like in China, whether we have it or we can access it. But certainly, what's fascinating among the sort of younger Iranians is they're much more enamored with a Trump victory. I mean, this seems completely anathema to us, right? But among young Iranians, people have interviewed them and they say, Trump, he gets us. He knows how these people operate. He'll be able to deal with them.
So is that, in the last 2 weeks, they've been saying that?
Well, it's when people have bothered to ask them. But no, it's a much longer thing. I mean, when they looked at Trump, they always said that Trump would be a better option for us. I mean, I'm talking about the opposition.
The reason why I'm pinning you down on it is obviously it appears at the moment as though Trump is talking a lot to Netanyahu. What do we really know? I'm interested then if what you're saying is that there's a natural tendency in Iran to prefer Trump for some reason, whether that's current or whether that's just a...
No, I'm talking about the younger opposition in Iran, who don't like the regime. I think the regime people are a little bit more anxious about it this time around, because remember, in 2016, you didn't have maximum pressure, you didn't have this. They were suffering from wishful thinking about what Trump represented, and then of course they got. The only thing they could take advantage of, as Bill was saying with the Chinese, was, well, he's the bad guy, people can focus on him. But it still wasn't easy for Iran. I mean, maximum pressure did a lot of damage. I think now, the situation in Iran economically and politically is even worse than it was in 2016. At least in 2016, you had the honeymoon period after the JCPOA. It all looked a bit rosy. Now things don't look good at all. So if Trump comes in and reinstitutes maximum pressure, there's a lot of people among the young and the more rebellious are saying, wonderful, fantastic, let's get these mullahs out. Whereas I think many in the political establishment now are going to be a little bit more anxious. And I suspect that all this gung-ho jingoism that was affecting some of the Iranian leadership about how we're going to teach Israel a lesson and we're going to hit back at them, I suspect Trump's election will have given them pause for thought. Do we get involved in this? Because we don't know how Trump will react. And everything, as you say, Suzanne, if you look at him, he's, him and Bibi are like best buddies. So, it's suddenly become a bit more dangerous. Again, we'll see what happens. We'll see who he appoints.
But it's precisely, Ali, that's the thing that is his kind of secret power in a way, which is that people don't know how he's going to jump. And I want to come back to Bill on China and Taiwan now, because that sense of having a risky person, a berserker in charge, obviously puts the people who have been seen, certainly in the Western commentary, as potentially the destabilizers. So President Xi is an example where, there's the thing about Taiwan and 2027. A number of analysts in the West are fixated about the fact that she has said that Taiwan will be Chinese by 2027, whatever.
Hasn't exactly said
whatever.
that.
I knew you were going to say that, but whatever it is, there's this thing about 2027 that will fall within Trump's second term. So how has this changed the calculations? If she is thinking about Taiwan, is he now less or more likely to try and do something destabilizing?
I don't think it changes the game very much for the mainland side in terms of the Taiwan Straits issue. I think that the assumption has always been and has to remain that an actual invasion attempt would trigger a U.S. response, and probably even a response from other countries as well, like, for example, Japan, which is much less committed to defense of Taiwan on paper than the US is. But that is, I think, the assumption in China about this. I don't think that will change. There's lots of reasons why I don't think an actual invasion is very likely at all in the foreseeable future. Certainly not between now and 2027. I don't understand, honestly, this fixation in a lot of Western circles around that date.
So, and just to give me, it is a fixation. So I'm hearing it an awful lot, and I think it's baked into the American policy planning, isn't it?
I don't know. I'm not sure about that, but I do hear it much more often than I think is at all warranted. China's position on Taiwan has not changed. It's not likely to change in the near future that I can foresee. China has always seen Taiwan as a part of China. It is a province that is under the control of a renegade government from the point of view of the mainland and needs to be reunified sooner rather than later, if at all possible. What does get modulated is the degree to which the mainland is ready to threaten military force. And actually, that hasn't changed that much in the last 20 years or more, since the very early 2000s. And in fact, it was at a much higher temperature in the late 1990s to early 2000s than it has been since about 2003. And that really hasn't changed much. So I don't quite understand some of the Western fixation with, the window's closing, et cetera, et cetera. I certainly do think it's advisable and necessary for Western militaries with interest in the region to plan for the possible contingency of a major crisis or even an invasion in Taiwan. But it's not something that I think is very likely to happen, or more likely now versus earlier or something like this. But what I also think is that where this change in the U.S. administration really presents a more interesting picture for China and for the Taiwan side of the Straits issue is indeed, first of all, for Taiwan, in that I think Taiwan's understanding of U.S. politics and of Trump in particular is far more nuanced, subtle, and detailed than the understanding of U.S. politics in most circles in the mainland. So not just the degree of expertise, but familiarity, exchange, dialogue, time spent in the U.S. by many of the top officials and decision makers is really, really extensive. There are fewer sort of political establishments, I think, very few political establishments in the world that understand the U.S. as well as the Taiwanese political establishment does. So I think there's a really interesting view in Taiwan of Trump and of Trump's election, which is that it's not exactly clear what he's going to do, right? That on the one hand, there are many in Trump's orbit who have been really full-throated defenders of Taiwan's interests, even more than many Taiwanese politicians would be, or at least in a more sort of bombastic way than a lot of Taiwanese politicians would be comfortable with. But then there have been others who have said, well, Taiwan's not our problem, right? And Trump himself has said, well, Taiwan is a drain on U.S. defense capability, and they're not paying for this or that, and all these other kinds of comments. So I think there's a concern, but there's also, I think, a general degree of confidence that Taiwan can maneuver through U.S. politics reasonably well to make sure that the fundamental sort of bedrock doesn't change in terms of that relationship that Taiwan has with the U.S. and governed by the Taiwan Relations Act, by the way, which is a really interesting and important piece of legislation back from 1979, and that therefore the reliance on sort of a U.S. defense backstop, if things really get very bad, wouldn't be lessened by Trump. I think the Taiwanese side of the bargain, of course, is that Taiwan will not declare de jure independence. And that's also, I think, well understood by everybody in almost all of the Taiwanese political landscape. Some would prefer sort of asserting that, well, we already have de facto independence, so we don't need to talk about that. Others would actually be prepared to think about ways of walking away, or not walking away, but walking back from being too close to the red line and actually saying we're not pushing even as far as that for independence. So I think that's fairly stable. Now, from the point of view of China and what this could mean with Trump, is it possible, maybe, that Trump could actually approach China with some sort of grand bargain or deal over Taiwan? That he would be willing potentially to sacrifice all American interest in defending Taiwan or protecting Taiwan's autonomy for the sake of a grand bargain with China. I don't think that's likely, honestly. I think that would be very unlikely for Trump or anyone in his orbit to agree to. But I think there could be some in China that would think that this is at least a potential eventuality. And if there's a way that they could shape things towards that, that would be very useful. But I don't know that anybody has any idea how they would do such shaping. But I think there is a sense that Trump could just prove quite accommodating over this. And that's where really the uncertainty is. And a lot of that would actually depend on how well Taiwan maneuvers its relationship with the new administration more than anything else. Because I think if they play it very, very badly, it could push Trump closer to that kind of position. Although, again, I think that's quite unlikely that he really moves in that direction.
So we've only got a short amount of time left, and I want to ask you both, because you're both experts on a country that is within the axis of resistance. And I want to ask each of you how well you think Trump's team understand China or Iran. And I'm going to ask Ali to speak first because, Bill, you've just been speaking, so we'll have some mixing it up. Because clearly that really matters, the depth and the breadth of the understanding of the adversary when you're crafting your policy, whatever it's going to be. Do you think Trump's team understand Iran?
So I think it all depends on who he appoints. And, I know Pompeo's been ruled out. I think Nikki Haley's out. I think some of them do understand things reasonably well. I mean, obviously, they're on a different area on the spectrum, shall we say. I don't think anyone in American politics, I mean, there's probably one or two that I could name, but I don't think most people in Iranian politics do not have a benign view of Iran. The question is, what do you do about it? And some will say, well, we need to engage, hug them close and this sort of thing. And others will say, no, we need to contain and we need to effectively suffocate. And I think depending on your reading of exactly what's going on in the country and what you want and the outcomes, obviously each has different merits and demerits and whatever. I happen to think that at the moment, it's fairly difficult to do the engaging bit. I mean, I don't know who you're going to engage with, but it may well be that in Iran, they start to push people forward because they're so worried, to restart sort of meaningful dialogues. And I put the emphasis on meaningful, by the way, because the last thing we want to do is be engaged in all sorts of discussions in Vienna and Geneva and all sorts that are leading nowhere. But I think the problem with Iran has at the moment in terms of all these different options is that its environment is completely different. I mean, because of what's going on in the Middle East, because of the Ukraine war, because of its own attitude, for instance, to dual nationals and the kidnapping and abduction of dual nationals. I mean, a lot of these things need to change in practice before the engagement side works. So I think in some ways, the more forgiving side that we might expect from a Trump administration might be the way forward to essentially persuade the Iranians, if I can put it that way, that they do need to sort of start adjusting some of their ambitions and some of their policies. The question of whether they know Iran is, as you know, Suzanne, I don't think anyone in policy circles actually has a clue what's going on. So my view is that as a good academic is that the learning curve is quite a steep one. But I would, let setting out the facetiousness aside a bit. I mean, I do think there are some good people on either side of the political spectrum who have a reasonably good handle on Iran. None of it is perfect. I think it would be helpful if they took some sound advice on certain areas. But it all depends on who Trump will appoint to his team. I do have some idea of some of the people he might appoint to his team. And some of the people, if they are appointed, do have a fairly long track record in dealing with Iran. But they're obviously not people who think that having tea and a cup of tea and a biscuit and whatever is going to get you any far. They take a much more robust attitude and a much more, I would say, confrontational attitude.
Thank you. That's a nice summary. Bill?
Yeah, I think in terms of China, it's somewhat similar. I mean, for about 30 years, engagement was the orthodoxy across the spectrum in American politics. And that really died in 2016, if not a bit before. And ever since Trump's first inauguration, the talk in terms of China policy has really been in terms of decoupling, de-risking, competition, confrontation, these kinds of things. Not just in security terms, but on economic terms as well. And so I think part of the problem is that the kind of establishment of expertise in America on China has been really deeply rooted in that engagement paradigm. And so it's actually very hard to find people who have deep expertise about China in policy circles who are not in some way on the engagement team. And if Trump really doesn't want to go down that road, either some of these erstwhile engagers will have to adjust, or he's going to end up appointing people who are less experienced or less competent or don't know as much about China, or at least many of them, because there just isn't that deep of a bench. A second issue is generational, right? That there was a flowering of China expertise in the US about 30 years ago. And it kind of ended about 10 to 15 years ago. There's a lot fewer people being trained in graduate programs and anything like that than there had been in the 90s and in the 2000s. And fewer of those people are going into government service, actually, than had been the case before. So the new generation of expertise is much smaller than the old one. The old one is even more deeply enmeshed with engagement. And several people who served in the first Trump administration with a fair degree of China expertise, albeit sometimes with kind of extreme views, they, it seems, will not get appointed to new posts in the new administration. So it is true that Trump has actually several people who I think he will draw on and who he's made signals that he will draw on, who have, broadly speaking, fairly subtle and informed views about how the U.S. should deal with Asia as a whole, where really the main issue is to what extent is the United States going to prioritize existing alliances with countries like Japan or the Philippines, and to what extent is it going to just go it alone in its Asia policy, and to what extent is it really aimed at containing or confronting China rather than simply de-risking. Those are sort of the main issues there. But in terms of actually the bilateral relationship, those people are not deep experts. And I think there'll be some difficulty in finding those experts because they've either aged out of the system or they're on the wrong team from Trump's point of view. So I think it will be a challenge, not just for the next few years, but potentially for a long time to come.
So thank you. You've both made very articulately the continuing case for the On Geopolitics podcast.
And what we need a real expert, Susan.
Yes, thank you, Ali. Good. So we've run out of time. I'm sorry, because clearly it's not enough time.
I know.
But I think both of you, to me, the fact that you both answered that question as you did isn't great, because the more unstable things are, the more important it is properly to understand the other side. As Bill, you were saying with the Taiwanese, understand America, So thank you both very much from me.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that was great. I'm sure this story has got a way to run.
But also, we are having this conversation before we know who all the picks are.
Yes,
so
that's true.
Let's come back to it in about a month and see how it's settling down and whether there's any stronger indicators of which way it's going to go. But thank you both very much. Goodbye from me.
Bye from me.
Goodbye and thank you.